Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Montana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the harsh winter of 1865, as the Civil War drew to its bloody close, another kind of darkness descended upon the remote forests of western Montana Territory. The name Silent Johnson would not appear in official records until March of that year, when a trapper named Elias Woodbury stumbled upon an abandoned cabin some 20 miles north of Virginia City. What Woodbury discovered inside that cabin would initiate one of the most disturbing investigations in the territory's early history, one that remained largely buried in territorial archives until a University of Montana historian uncovered the fragmented case files in 1962. The cabin stood in a clearing, unremarkable except for the absolute silence surrounding it. No birds sang, no creatures stirred in the underbrush. According to Woodbury's sworn statement to the territorial marshal, he approached the cabin thinking it might offer shelter for the night. The door hung partially open. A thin layer of snow had drifted across the threshold. Inside, Woodbury found a meticulously ordered space. Tools hung on the walls in perfect alignment. Preserved meats were arranged by size in a corner. A journal lay open on a crude table, its final entry dated December 18, 1864. The entry contained only 5 words: "They will not find me." The cabin belonged to Abraham Johnson, a mountain man who had established himself in the region around 1859. According to land claim records filed in Virginia City, Johnson had a reputation among the scattered settlers and mining camps for 2 things: his impressive skills as a hunter and trapper, and his complete refusal to speak, hence the moniker Silent Johnson. Those who encountered him in Virginia City or other settlements reported that he communicated only through nods, gestures, or occasionally written notes. Some assumed he was mute from birth. Others speculated he had suffered some trauma that stole his voice. The truth, as investigators would later discover, was far more disturbing. What troubled Woodbury most was not the abandoned cabin itself, but what he found behind it. A narrow trail led from the rear door into the dense pine forest. Woodbury, an experienced frontiersman himself, noted something unusual about this path. Unlike game trails or typical human paths that showed signs of natural use, this one had been meticulously maintained. Low branches had been precisely cut. Rocks had been removed and placed in unnatural patterns alongside the trail. Most disturbing of all, Woodbury discovered small pieces of metal, buckles, buttons, watch parts, embedded at regular intervals in the trunks of trees along the path, hammered deep into the living wood. Woodbury followed the trail for approximately half a mile before turning back. He would later tell the territorial marshal that an overwhelming sense of dread prevented him from continuing. "The forest felt wrong," he stated in his official testimony, "like it was watching me. I've spent 30 years in wilderness and never felt anything like it." He returned to Virginia City and reported his discovery. Marshal James Owens assembled a 5-man posse to investigate the cabin and the mysterious trail. Their findings, documented in yellowed reports now preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives, form the foundation of what we know about Silent Johnson. The posse spent 3 days at the site. They followed the trail to its conclusion, a natural amphitheater of stone deep in the forest, where they discovered what appeared to be an elaborate arrangement of animal bones, forming patterns that none of the men recognized. Among the bones were personal effects: pocket watches, wedding rings, spectacles, and other items typically carried by travelers of the era. The marshal's report indicates that a thorough search of the cabin revealed a hidden space beneath the floorboards. Inside this compartment, they discovered a collection of journals dating back to 1853. The earliest entries were written in a flowing, educated hand and signed Abraham Lincoln Johnson, formerly of Boston, Massachusetts. The writing documented Johnson's journey west, initially as part of a scientific expedition to catalog the flora and fauna of the Western Territories. Johnson had apparently been educated at Harvard as a naturalist, The journals chronicled a gradual transformation. Early entries were detailed scientific observations. By 1857, the entries had become increasingly erratic. Johnson described hearing voices in the wind and messages in the movement of animals. He wrote about the language of the forest and his attempts to understand it. The final journal, the one Woodbury had seen open on the table, contained almost no recognizable English. Instead, the pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings that resembled both animal tracks and crude human figures. Marshall Owens sent word to authorities in Boston, seeking information about Johnson's background. The response, received 3 months later, confirmed that Abraham Lincoln Johnson had been a promising student of natural philosophy at Harvard, who had departed for a Western expedition in 1853 and never returned. His family had presumed him dead. More significantly, the Boston authorities revealed that Johnson had been briefly institutionalized in 1852 following what was described as an episode of acute melancholia accompanied by delusions. The attending physician's notes indicated that Johnson had become obsessed with the concept of communication beyond human understanding. What happened between Johnson's departure from Boston and his establishment in the Montana wilderness remains largely conjecture. Gold miners in Virginia City who had occasional dealings with Johnson described him as intensely private but fair in his transactions. He would bring in high-quality furs and meat to trade for supplies, always conducting business through written notes. John Granville, owner of the Virginia City General Store from 1860 to 1868, kept several of Johnson's notes. In an interview conducted in 1870, Granville recalled that Johnson's handwriting had deteriorated over time, eventually becoming almost illegible. In the beginning, his notes were proper and educated-like, Granville stated. Toward the end, I could barely make out what he wanted. The writing looked like it was done by a man whose hand was guided by something else. The investigation took a darker turn when Marshall Owens connected Johnson's case to a series of disappearances that had occurred in the region between 1861 and 1864. At least 7 travelers had vanished while journeying between Virginia City and neighboring settlements. At the time, such disappearances were not uncommon in the harsh territory. People went missing in blizzards, fell victim to animal attacks, or encountered hostile individuals. What caught Owens's attention was the pattern. All of the disappearances had occurred within a 10-mile radius of Johnson's cabin. The posse returned to the forest amphitheater with a more specific purpose. They began carefully examining and cataloging the personal effects found among the bone arrangements. A pocket watch belonging to Frederick Chambers, a mining engineer, reported missing in September 1863. A distinctive silver ring identified as the property of William Ellis, a courier who had disappeared in early 1864 while carrying documents between Virginia City and Bannock. A pair of German-made spectacles that matched the description of those worn by Joseph Mueller, a European immigrant last seen in December 1862. The bone arrangements themselves presented a mystery that remained unsolved. Dr. Thomas Penfield, a physician from Virginia City who accompanied the second expedition, identified the bones as primarily coming from elk, deer, mountain lions, and bears. However, he noted in his report that the bones had been modified in ways inconsistent with natural decomposition or animal scavenging. Specifically, many bones showed evidence of precise cutting and unusual polishing. Some had been joined together to create composite structures that resembled neither the original animals nor any known objects. Most disturbing were Dr. Penfield's observations about certain marks on the bones. I hesitate to describe these markings as writing, he wrote, yet they display a deliberate patterning that suggests attempted communication. The symbols bear some resemblance to those found in Johnson's later journals, though executed with greater precision. The posse found no human remains in the amphitheater or surrounding area. This absence would later fuel speculation about the ultimate fate of the missing travelers. Had Johnson killed them and disposed of their bodies elsewhere? Had they met some other end entirely? The investigation provided no definitive answers. The search for Silent Johnson himself proved fruitless. Tracking experts among the posse identified trail signs indicating that someone had departed from the cabin approximately 2 weeks before Woodbury's discovery, heading deeper into the wilderness toward the Bitterroot Mountains. The harsh winter conditions and the vast territory made pursuit impractical. Marshal Owens officially listed Johnson as wanted for questioning in connection with the disappearances, but no organized manhunt was ever mounted. The case might have faded entirely from memory had it not been for an unusual encounter reported in June 1866. A hunting party from Fort Owen, located in the Bitterroot Valley some 80 miles west of Virginia City, described meeting a solitary figure on a high mountain ridge. The man wore clothing made entirely of animal hides and carried a rifle of an outdated design. When the hunters approached, the figure retreated into a dense thicket. The hunters followed and discovered a small camp containing items similar to those documented in Johnson's cabin. Tools arranged in precise patterns, animal bones configured in unnatural positions, and trees marked with metal objects. The hunters reported their finding to authorities at Fort Owen, but no further investigation was conducted. The location was remote, and military resources were focused on more pressing concerns in the post-war period. This brief report represents the last credible sighting of anyone who might have been Abraham Silent Johnson. In the summer of 1866, another disturbing discovery was made that potentially connected to the Johnson case. A group of miners working a claim near the headwaters of the Jefferson River, approximately 30 miles southeast of Johnson's cabin, uncovered what they described as a bone cellar while excavating a hillside. According to their report to local authorities, they found a small, carefully constructed chamber containing animal bones arranged in patterns similar to those discovered in the forest amphitheater. The miners, superstitious men accustomed to the harshness of frontier life, immediately abandoned the site, claiming the discovery made them sick with dread. They refused to return to the location or provide precise directions. Marshal Owens, still intrigued by the Johnson case despite the lack of official pursuit, visited the mining camp to interview the men. His unofficial report, found among his personal papers after his death, describes the miners as genuinely terrified, beyond what would be expected from hardened men familiar with wilderness dangers. One miner, identified only as Sullivan, reportedly told Owens, "Whatever made that place wasn't thinking like a man anymore. I've seen Indian burials and hunters' caches. This was something else. Like looking at something made by insects, but too smart." Owens attempted to locate the site based on the miners' vague directions, but was unsuccessful. In his notes, he speculated that the bone cellar might have been one of several locations established by Johnson throughout the region. "The pattern suggests a network," Owens wrote, "arranged according to some logic I cannot discern. The distances between known sites do not appear random." This speculation gained additional support in the spring of 1867, when a surveying team working for the territorial government discovered yet another site containing bone arrangements. This one located near the Continental Divide, approximately 45 miles northeast of Johnson's cabin. The surveyor's report described finding a small cave entrance partially concealed by precisely arranged rocks. Inside, they found what they called a museum of bones, hundreds of animal remains arranged in concentric circles. At the center of the arrangement stood a crude tripod made from elk antlers, supporting what appeared to be a primitive astronomical instrument fashioned from bone and metal fragments. The survey team's leader, Edward Hamilton, was familiar with the Johnson case through personal connections with Marshal Owens. In his report, Hamilton noted the deliberate nature of the arrangements and the similarities to previous discoveries. "Whatever purpose these sites serve," he wrote, "they suggest a mind working according to some consistent internal logic. The precision of the arrangements, particularly the astronomical device, indicates a methodical approach rather than random madness." Hamilton included detailed sketches of the cave arrangements in his report. These drawings, preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives, show striking similarities to patterns found in Johnson's later journals. Particularly notable is a recurring motif that resembles a spiral intersected by radiating lines. This symbol appears prominently in both the cave arrangements and in Johnson's final journal entries. What makes the Johnson case particularly disturbing is not just these physical remnants, but what they suggest about the transformation of a human mind under isolation. The progression documented in Johnson's journals, from Harvard-educated scientist to silent woodland figure communicating through bone arrangements, represents a profound psychological shift. Modern analysts have proposed various explanations for this transformation, ranging from progressive mental illness to a deliberate adaptation to wilderness immersion. Dr. Margaret Lawson, a clinical psychologist who studied the case records in 1965, suggested that Johnson might have experienced what she termed environmental personality reconstruction, a complete reformatting of identity in response to extreme isolation and environmental immersion. The journals document not just a deterioration, she wrote in a paper published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, but a methodical reconstruction of consciousness using non-human patterns as building blocks. Johnson appears to have deliberately abandoned human frameworks of understanding and attempted to construct an alternative. Johnson's journals from the Middle Period, 1857-1860, contain numerous references to his growing disillusionment with human language. "Words fracture the world," he wrote in an entry from August 1858. "They separate and categorize what is fundamentally whole. The forest speaks in patterns, movements, relationships, not in the broken pieces we call nouns and verbs." By 1859, he had begun experimenting with alternative forms of notation, creating symbols based on animal tracks, plant growth patterns, and astronomical observations. A particularly revealing entry from April 1859 reads, "Today I remained silent for the entire day. No words passed my lips, not even in solitude. Instead, I listened. The revelation was immediate. Without the constant internal narration, I perceived connections previously invisible. The movement of a pine marten through the canopy, the response of wind patterns to terrain, the subtle shifts in temperature throughout the day, all spoke in a language more profound than words. I shall continue this practice." By 1860, according to traders' accounts, Johnson had stopped speaking entirely. His communications with others in Virginia City and surrounding settlements were conducted entirely through written notes. By 1862, even these notes had begun to incorporate strange symbols alongside conventional writing. By 1864, the last traders to interact with Johnson reported that his written communications had become almost entirely symbolic, with only occasional recognizable words. The progression continued in his private journals. The final volume recovered from the cabin shows a complete transition to a symbolic language that combines elements of pictography, ideography, and abstract patterning. Dr. William Stern, the linguist who later studied these symbols, noted that they displayed consistent internal logic and systematic development. "This is not random marking," Stern wrote in his analysis. "This is a constructed communication system with its own syntax and semantic principles." The tragedy is that it was likely comprehensible only to Johnson himself. The personal effects found among the bone arrangements in the forest amphitheater provided the most concrete connection between Johnson and the disappearances that had occurred in the region. Between 1861 and 1864, 7 travelers had vanished within proximity of Johnson's territory. Marshall Owens's investigation confirmed the identities of at least 4 of these individuals through items found at the site. Frederick Chambers, a mining engineer employed by Eastern investors to assess gold claims near Virginia City, disappeared in September 1863 while traveling between mining camps. His distinctive gold pocket watch, engraved with his initials and the date of his Harvard graduation, was found incorporated into one of the bone arrangements. William Ellis, a courier who regularly carried documents between Virginia City and Bannock, vanished in early 1864. His silver ring, custom-made by a Bannock silversmith and easily identifiable by an unusual gemstone setting, was discovered embedded in a tree trunk along Johnson's trail. Joseph Miller, a German immigrant and skilled carpenter who had been hired to help construct government buildings in Virginia City, disappeared in December 1862 while returning from a hunting trip. His spectacles, made by a specific craftsman in Munich and unusual in the territory, were found positioned at what appeared to be the focal point of one bone arrangement. Thomas Blackwood, a writer for the Montana Post newspaper who had been documenting frontier life for Eastern readers, vanished in July 1864 while researching an article about wilderness trappers. His journal, containing half-finished notes about the region's inhabitants, was discovered hidden beneath a precisely arranged pile of stones near the amphitheater. The three other documented disappearances, a prospector named James Walsh, a land surveyor named Robert Carson, and a fur trader identified only as Dubois, could not be conclusively connected to Johnson through physical evidence, though the pattern of their disappearances fit the same geographical distribution. Notably absent from all sites investigated were any human remains. This absence led some contemporary observers to speculate that Johnson might not have killed the missing men at all, but rather subjected them to some unknown fate. Marshall Owens, in his private notes, wrote, "The lack of bodies troubles me more than their presence would. If Johnson killed these men, where are they? And if he did not kill them, what became of them?" This question gained an unsettling dimension through a document discovered in the territorial governor's correspondence in 1964. The document, a letter dated November 1865 from a railroad surveyor named Philip Jenkins, described a strange encounter in the mountains west of Johnson's territory. While taking measurements near the pass, Jenkins wrote, "My assistant and I observed a figure moving along a distant ridge. The manner of movement was peculiar, not walking upright as a man would, but not moving on all fours like an animal either, a sort of fluid, crouching gait. When we called out, the figure stopped and turned toward us. Through my glass I could see it was human in form, though dressed in what appeared to be animal hides. More disturbing was the behavior. The figure began making gestures unlike any Indian signs I know, moving its arms in patterns that reminded me of a hawk's wings or a snake's undulation. When we approached, it retreated into the trees. We found its trail but lost it at a stream. Most curious was that my assistant, who had previously worked in Virginia City, believed he recognized the figure as a man named Ellis, who had disappeared the previous year. Though he could not be certain at such a distance, the suggestion is troubling. This report raises the disturbing possibility that at least some of the missing persons might have undergone transformations similar to Johnson's own, adopting his peculiar mode of communication and his wilderness adaptation. If true, this would suggest something beyond simple murder, perhaps a deliberate process of conversion or initiation. The scientific expedition that first brought Abraham Johnson west in 1853 had been led by Professor William Harrington of Harvard University. Records of this expedition are fragmentary, but they indicate that its purpose was to document the flora, fauna, and geological features of the Northwestern Territories. Johnson was listed as the expedition's naturalist and artist, responsible for cataloging and illustrating specimens. The expedition departed from St. Louis in April 1853 with 8 members. By the time it returned in November 1854, only 5 remained. One man had died of typhoid fever. Johnson and another member, identified only as Crawford, were reported to have separated from the main party near the present-day Montana-Idaho border in August 1854. Professor Harrington's expedition journal, preserved in the Harvard University archives, contains a curious entry dated August 17, 1854. Johnson and Crawford have elected to remain behind to conduct more thorough documentation of the alpine flora. Johnson has been particularly affected by the region's qualities, speaking at length about the voice of the wilderness. I fear isolation has begun to affect his reason, yet his work remains exceptional. We have agreed to rendezvous at Fort Hall in 3 weeks' time. A subsequent entry from September 10th simply states, "No sign of Johnson or Crawford at the appointed meeting place. Must presume them lost or deliberately absent." In 1962, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood discovered additional pages from Harrington's journal that had been separated from the main document and misfiled in the Harvard archives. These pages, covering the period immediately before Johnson's separation from the expedition, contain troubling observations about his behavior. Johnson has grown increasingly withdrawn. Harrington wrote on August 10, 1854, "He speaks rarely, and when he does, his comments have taken on a strange quality. He refers to the wilderness as an entity with agency and intention. Yesterday he claimed the mountains were trying to teach him something. His work, however, continues to be exemplary. His illustrations capture details I myself cannot perceive until he reveals them on paper. Crawford has taken to following Johnson on his solitary excursions. I fear Crawford's scientific objectivity is being compromised by Johnson's influence." The final entry regarding Johnson, dated August 16th, describes a disturbing incident. "Last night, I was awakened by unusual sounds from Johnson's tent. Upon investigation, I found him seated cross-legged on the ground, surrounded by small animal bones arranged in patterns. He was making sounds unlike any language I recognize, rhythmic and patterned, but not words as we understand them. When I spoke his name, he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as pitying. 'You cannot hear it yet,' he said. 'But you will?' Crawford was seated nearby, watching with rapt attention. 'I have decided it best they continue their work separately from our main party. No record exists of Crawford ever emerging from the wilderness. His identity and fate remain unknown, though some researchers have speculated that he may have been among the first to be influenced by whatever transformation overtook Johnson. If this speculation is correct, it suggests that Johnson's condition might have been communicable in some fashion, not a disease in the conventional sense, but a transmission of perception or understanding. The most tantalizing connection to the Johnson case emerged in 1965, when anthropologist Robert Chambers published a study of pictographic traditions among certain isolated bands of the Salish people in western Montana. Chambers documented a series of rock paintings dating from approximately 1860 to 1870 that depicted what appeared to be a solitary human figure surrounded by concentric circles of animal forms. According to Chambers' indigenous informants, these paintings represented a Wendigo-like figure they called the man who speaks to bones, tribal. Histories describe this entity as a former human who had forgotten how to be a man and instead learned the old language of the animals. What makes this connection particularly significant is that the Salish bands who created these paintings had minimal contact with white settlers during this period. Their territories lay well north of the mining settlements, in regions rarely traversed by anyone except occasional fur trappers. Yet their depiction of the man who speaks to bones bears striking similarities to what is known of Johnson, a solitary figure who communicated through arrangements of animal remains and moved through the wilderness in a manner described as neither fully human nor animal. Chambers, unfamiliar with the Johnson case at the time of his research, made no connection between the tribal legends and the historical record. It was not until 1968, when a graduate student named Michael Finch happened to read both Chambers' anthropological study and Dr. Blackwood's paper on Johnson, that the potential link was identified. Finch's subsequent thesis proposal to investigate this connection was rejected by his department as excessively speculative. His academic career was short-lived, and his research notes were never published. However, Finch did conduct several interviews with Salish elders in 1968, seeking additional information about the man who speaks to bones. Transcripts of these interviews, preserved in Finch's personal papers, donated to the University of Montana Archives after his death in 1994, contain disturbing details not included in Chambers' published work. According to one elder, the entity was believed to be creating a new tribe, neither human nor animal, but something between. Another described how the entity would take people who traveled alone, not to kill them, but to change them. Most significantly, one elder recounted a story of a hunter who claimed to have observed the entity from hiding. He moved like water flows, not like a man walks. Around him, the forest was different. Animals that should fear each other stood together. He made marks on trees that changed how the forest grew. He spoke, but not with a human voice. He spoke the way wind speaks through different trees, making many sounds that together have meaning. These descriptions suggest that the tribal communities perceived something beyond a simple hermit or murderer, something that was actively reshaping its environment, according to an alternative system of order. This aligns disturbingly well with the physical evidence found at Johnson's various sites. The precisely maintained trail, the methodically arranged bones, the trees marked with metal objects, the astronomical devices constructed from natural materials. Dr. Thomas Penfield, the physician who examined the bone arrangements, continued to be troubled by his experience long after the official investigation had ceased. In 1872, he published a medical paper titled Isolation Psychosis in Frontier Environments, which referenced the Johnson case without naming it specifically. Penfield proposed that extended solitude combined with the inherent dangers and sensory bombardment of wilderness life could produce unique psychological adaptations. The mind, deprived of human contact, yet constantly stimulated by natural phenomena, may construct alternative frameworks of meaning, he wrote. In extreme cases, these frameworks may become more real to the affected individual than conventional human society. Penfield's paper was largely dismissed by the medical establishment of the time. Modern researchers, however, have noted similarities between his observations and contemporary understanding of certain dissociative disorders and environmental adaptation syndromes. Penfield himself apparently remained haunted by the case. His personal diary, discovered after his death in 1879, contains repeated references to dreams about the forest cathedral and the man who learned a different language. The final entry, dated 3 days before his death from pneumonia, reads simply, "I understand now why he stopped speaking." Words are inadequate. What is perhaps most disturbing about the Johnson case is not what it reveals about one man's psychological transformation, but what it suggests about the potential plasticity of human consciousness when removed from social context. Johnson was not an uneducated man driven mad by isolation. He was a Harvard-trained scientist, presumably well-versed in rational thought and scientific method. Yet something in his prolonged immersion in the wilderness environment fundamentally altered his mode of perception and communication. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, in her unpublished notes on the case, speculated that Johnson might represent an extreme example of environmental adaptation. We tend to think of human consciousness as something fixed and universal, but Johnson's case suggests otherwise. What if our conventional modes of perception and categorization are not inherent to human cognition, but rather artifacts of our specific cultural and environmental context? Johnson's journals document the deliberate abandonment of one perceptual framework and the painstaking construction of another. The tragedy, or perhaps the transcendence, is that his new framework became increasingly incommunicable to others, operating within conventional human parameters. This perspective was echoed decades later by Dr. Richard Merrill, a cognitive anthropologist who reviewed the Johnson materials in 1975 in an article titled Wilderness, Cognition and Perceptual Plasticity. Merrill suggested that Johnson's transformation might represent not a deterioration, but an adaptation. The human brain evolved in constant interaction with natural environments over hundreds of thousands of years. Our current modes of perception, heavily mediated by language and technology, represent a recent developmental layer. Johnson's case raises the unsettling possibility that prolonged immersion in wilderness, combined with the deliberate suspension of linguistic processing, might access older cognitive modalities, ways of perceiving and organizing information that predate our current consciousness. Merrill's speculation remains controversial in scientific circles, yet it offers a framework for understanding one of the most puzzling aspects of the Johnson case, the evident purposefulness and systematic nature of his behavior even after he had abandoned conventional human communication. The bone arrangements, the marked trees, the astronomical devices all suggest not random madness, but an alternative organizational logic, a different way of imposing order on experience. Marshal James Owens never officially closed the Johnson case. In his annual report to territorial authorities for 1865, he listed it among ongoing investigations, though no further resources were allocated to its pursuit. Owens served as marshal until 1868, when he resigned his position and purchased land near Missoula. Interestingly, Owens became something of a recluse in his later years. Neighbors reported that he spent increasing amounts of time alone in the forests surrounding his property. When he died in 1873, hunters found his body seated against a tree facing east. According to the coroner's report, Owens had been dead for approximately 2 weeks when discovered. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, likely heart failure. The report noted that Owens's facial expression was remarkably peaceful, a detail not included in the official coroner's report, but mentioned in a letter from the coroner to Owens' brother, was the discovery of a small arrangement of stones and animal bones near where Owens's body was found. The arrangement reportedly resembled those associated with the Johnson case. The coroner, aware of Owens's professional history, chose to omit this detail from the official record, considering it irrelevant to the cause of death. Yet it raises the disturbing possibility that Owens himself might have been drawn into whatever pattern of perception Johnson had established. In the decades following Johnson's disappearance, the region where he had established his cabin underwent significant changes. The Northern Pacific Railroad arrived in the 1880s, bringing increased settlement and development. Logging operations cleared vast sections of the forest. The isolated wilderness that had shaped Johnson's experience gradually receded, yet stories persisted. Loggers in the 1890s reported finding trees with metal objects embedded in their trunks, now grown over and nearly engulfed by the living wood. Railroad surveyors described discovering peculiar arrangements of stones and animal bones in remote ravines. A hunting guide named Samuel Blackfoot claimed to have encountered an elderly white man living in a cave near the Idaho border in 1901. The man wore animal skins and refused to speak. When Blackfoot attempted to approach him, the man vanished into the forest with the skill of a ghost. Blackfoot reported finding the cave filled with intricate bone arrangements and trees marked with metal fragments. In 1897, a geological survey team mapping mineral deposits in the Bitterroot Range discovered a series of symbols carved into rock faces at high elevations. The team leader, Dr. James Morrison, noted in his report that the symbols bear a striking resemblance to certain Native American pictographs, yet exhibit a precision and mathematical quality absent from indigenous work. Morrison, unfamiliar with the Johnson case, attributed the carvings to an unknown indigenous culture with unusually advanced geometric understanding. When these carvings were rediscovered in 1963 by a Forest Service ranger named Robert Peterson, who was familiar with Dr. Blackwood's research, the similarity to symbols in Johnson's final journal was immediately apparent. The most recent documented connection to the Johnson case occurred in 1957, when 2 forestry workers surveying timber stands in the remote Cabinet Mountains discovered what they described as a bone hut, a small shelter constructed from interlocking animal bones and antlers held together without bindings through precise notching and fitting. Inside the shelter they found a collection of small objects, metal buttons, fragments of pocket watches, pieces of eyeglass frames, and other man-made items, all arranged in concentric circles. At the center of the arrangement lay a crude book fashioned from bark and animal hide. The pages contained markings similar to those in Johnson's final journal. The forestry workers reported their find to local authorities, who dismissed it as likely the work of some mountain hermit or eccentric trapper. The bone hut was not preserved, and its exact location was not recorded with precision. The book, however, was kept by one of the workers, Harold Jenkins, as a curiosity. In 1964, Jenkins attended a public lecture by Dr. Blackwood on frontier history and recognized similarities between the symbols she displayed from Johnson's journal and those in the book he had found. Jenkins approached Blackwood after the lecture and showed her the book. Blackwood's notes on this meeting, found among her papers after her death, express both excitement and dread. The symbols are unmistakably from the same system Johnson developed. The progression is evident. These are more complex, more integrated than those in his final journal. If this book was indeed created in the 1950s, as Jenkins believes based on the condition of the materials, it suggests something almost unthinkable. Either Johnson himself survived to an impossibly advanced age, or someone else continued his work. The implications are equally disturbing either way. Jenkins donated the book to the University of Montana Archives in 1965. It remained there, largely unstudied until 1974, when linguist Maria Carlson attempted a systematic analysis of the symbols. Carlson's work, published in the obscure Journal of Wilderness Psychology, proposed that the marking system had evolved from a simple representational method into something more abstract and complex. What began in Johnson's journals as modified pictographs based on natural forms has developed into a complete alternative symbolic language. The syntax has consistent internal logic. The symbols show evidence of both concrete and abstract representation capabilities. Most remarkably, the system appears capable of expressing relationships and processes, not just objects, a key feature of advanced communication. Systems. Carlson's analysis included the disturbing observation that certain symbol combinations in the Bone Hut book had no precedent in Johnson's known journals. These appear to be new developments, she wrote, suggesting continued evolution of the system beyond what Johnson himself had achieved by 1865. Whether this evolution occurred through Johnson's own continued work or through others adopting and extending his system remains unknown. The forests where Silent Johnson once moved have changed dramatically over the past century and a half. Commercial logging, fire management practices, road construction, and climate shifts have transformed the landscape. The remote wilderness that could once swallow a man completely has been mapped, photographed, and developed. Yet even today, the region contains valleys and ridges rarely visited by humans, places where the original character of the land persists. In such a place, in the autumn of 1959, two backpackers discovered a small cave entrance partially hidden by fallen logs. Inside, they found the remains of what appered to be a crude living space, a stone hearth, rotted fragments of animal hide, and rusted metal tools. What drew their attention, however, was a series of markings carved into the cave walls. The backpackers, both university students with archaeological interests, recognized the markings as potentially significant and photographed them before continuing their journey. The photographs submitted to the anthropology department at the University of Montana eventually came to the attention of Dr. William Stern, a linguist specializing in non-Indo-European language systems. Dr. Stern's analysis, published in a limited academic circulation in 1961, identified the markings as a structured communication system utilizing elements of pictography, ideography, and abstract symbolism. Most significantly, Stern noted striking similarities between these cave markings and the fragmentary journal entries from the final Johnson journal that had been preserved in Dr. Blackwood's research notes. What we appear to be seeing, Stern wrote, is the development of a unique notational system, not quite language in the conventional sense, but certainly an organized attempt at recording information. The system incorporates elements that suggest inspiration from natural patterns, animal movements, weather phenomena, and astronomical observations. If these markings were indeed created by the historical figure known as Silent Johnson, they represent an extraordinary case of linguistic invention under isolation. Stern's paper attracted little attention outside specialized academic circles. The cave itself was never properly excavated. A forest fire swept through the area in 1962, potentially destroying any remaining evidence. Stern himself reportedly became increasingly preoccupied with the markings, covering the walls of his university office with reproductions and attempted translations. In 1964, he took a leave of absence from the university to conduct field research. He never returned to his position. According to former colleagues, Stern spent his final years living in a remote cabin in the Bitterroot Valley, working obsessively on what he described as the language of the forest. He died in 1968, leaving behind thousands of pages of notes that his executor, following Stern's explicit instructions, burned unread. The fate of Stern represents another disturbing pattern in the Johnson case, the tendency for those who study it deeply to become drawn into its logic. Dr. Blackwood, despite maintaining scientific objectivity in her published work, admitted in private correspondence to experiencing troubling dreams featuring symbols from Johnson's journals. The graduate student Michael Finch, after his thesis proposal on the Johnson-Salish connection was rejected, reportedly spent several months camping alone in the Cabinet Mountains before abandoning academic life entirely. Even Marshall Owens, the practical frontier lawman who first investigated the case, eventually retreated into isolation in the same forests where Johnson had roamed. This pattern suggests something beyond simple psychological fascination. Dr. Carlson, in the conclusion to her analysis of the Bone Hut book, proposed a troubling hypothesis. What if Johnson's symbolic system is not merely a private language, but a genuine alternative mode of organizing perception, one that, once understood, fundamentally alters how one processes sensory information? The consistent effect on researchers who immerse themselves in these symbols suggests a kind of cognitive contagion, as if the very act of comprehending this system restructures neural pathways in ways that make conventional human communication increasingly difficult. This perspective frames the Johnson case not as a simple mystery of frontier violence or psychological deterioration, but as something more fundamentally challenging to our understanding of human consciousness. If Johnson did indeed develop an alternative perceptual framework, one that could be transmitted to others through exposure to its symbolic expression, then the implications extend far beyond a single historical case. In 1967, a journal was discovered in a second-hand bookstore in Missoula. The journal, dated 1865-1866, belonged to a fur trapper named Jeremiah Collins. Most entries concerned mundane aspects of frontier life. However, an entry from February 1866 described an encounter in the high country near the Idaho border. Saw a man today unlike any I've encountered. Dressed all in hides but moved like an animal. Followed him for near half a mile before he sensed me. He turned and looked straight at me. His eyes were human, but something else looked out from behind them. He made a sound, not words exactly, but something patterned, like he was speaking in another tongue entirely. Left me cold despite the exertion. Did not pursue further. A later entry, dated April 1866, contains a more troubling observation. Found strange markings on trees near my western trapline. Metal pieces embedded in patterns. Reminds me of the strange man I saw in February. More disturbing are the bone piles I've found. Not killed by predators, but arranged deliberate-like. Something is watching me in that valley. Will reset my lines elsewhere. The final entry in Collins's journal, dated May 12, 1866, reads simply, "The trees speak if you listen right. Going to listen better." According to records from Virginia City, Collins never returned to claim furs he had stored there. He was presumed lost in the wilderness, one of many such casualties in the harsh frontier environment. The Collins Journal adds another piece to the Johnson puzzle, suggesting that whatever transformation Johnson underwent might not have been unique to him. Collins, an experienced frontiersman with no known connection to Johnson's academic background, appears to have encountered similar perceptual shifts after exposure to the symbolic system. This supports the cognitive contagion theory proposed by later researchers. In 1969, this theory gained additional credibility through an unexpected source. Dr. Robert Carlton, a neurologist at the University of Washington, published a paper on pattern-induced perceptual shifts in the Journal of Neurological Science. Carlton had been studying the neurological effects of extended exposure to certain types of visual patterns, particularly those involving nested recursive elements. His research, conducted on volunteer subjects, demonstrated that prolonged viewing of specific pattern types could induce measurable changes in visual processing, temporarily altering how subjects perceived unrelated visual stimuli. Carlton was unaware of the Johnson case when conducting his research. However, when a colleague familiar with Dr. Stern's work on the cave markings noted similarities between Carlton's experimental patterns and some of Johnson's symbols, Carlton obtained copies of the available materials. His subsequent analysis, published as an appendix to his original paper, identified several key patterns in Johnson's symbolic system that closely resembled those shown to be neurologically active in his experiments. The symbols in these historical documents display properties we've identified as potentially affecting visual processing pathways, Carlton wrote. Particularly notable are the recursive spiral elements combined with radiating lines, which our research shows can induce temporary alterations in pattern recognition and spatial processing. If an individual created these symbols through intuitive experimentation and then exposed themselves to them repeatedly over years, the neurological effects might be significant and lasting. Carlton's research provided a potential scientific framework for understanding aspects of the Johnson case that had previously seemed merely mysterious or supernatural. It suggested that Johnson, through his naturalist training and isolated experimentation, might have inadvertently developed a symbolic system capable of inducing actual neurological changes, first in himself and later in others exposed to the symbols. This perspective does not fully explain all elements of the case, particularly the bone arrangements, the marked trees, and the apparent communication with natural processes. However, it offers a starting point for understanding how a Harvard-educated scientist might transform into a figure who abandoned conventional human communication and developed an alternative mode of engaging with the environment. The final verified document related to the Johnson case is a letter written by Marshall James Owens to his successor in 1868 upon Owens's retirement. The letter, discovered in Territorial Archives in 1963, contains a passage that seems to reflect Owens's lingering preoccupation with the case. I advise you not to reopen the matter of A. Johnson should any new reports emerge. Some mysteries serve best as warnings rather than puzzles to be solved. The forest has its own justice and its own tongue. Let it keep its secrets. This cryptic advice, coming from a man previously committed to thorough investigation, suggests that Owens had reached some conclusion about the case that he was unwilling to express directly. The reference to the forest's own justice implies that Owens had come to view Johnson not simply as a criminal to be pursued, but as something transformed beyond the reach of human law. Owens's subsequent retreat into semi-isolation near Missoula and the discovery of bone arrangements near his body at death raised the disturbing possibility that he himself had begun to perceive or experience whatever Johnson had encountered in the wilderness. If this speculation is correct, it suggests that the cognitive contagion might spread not only through direct exposure to the symbolic system, but also through prolonged engagement with the case itself, as if the very act of trying to understand Johnson's transformation could initiate a similar process in the investigator. This pattern continued with later researchers. Dr. Blackwood, despite her academic caution, reportedly spent her final years increasingly preoccupied with the Johnson symbols, covering the walls of her home office with reproductions and attempted interpretations. Dr. Stern abandoned his academic career entirely to pursue field research in the same regions where Johnson had operated. Even Dr. Carlton, the neurologist whose work provided a scientific framework for understanding aspects of the case, noted in private correspondence that he had begun experiencing unusual perceptual episodes after extended work with the Johnson symbols. The most recent documented connection to the Johnson case occurred in 1965, when a Forest Service ranger named Thomas Bennett discovered a series of trees with metal objects embedded in their trunks while surveying a remote area of the Cabinet Mountains wilderness. The pattern of embedment matched that described in the original reports of Johnson's trail. Bennett, familiar with frontier history, though not specifically with the Johnson case, photographed the trees and included them in his survey report as evidence of historical human activity. When the photographs came to the attention of researchers familiar with the Johnson case in 1967, a small expedition was organized to investigate the site. Led by Dr. Richard Merrill, the cognitive anthropologist who would later publish on wilderness cognition, the team spent 2 weeks in the area, documenting not only the marked trees but also several small arrangements of stones and animal bones that seemed to match the patterns described in the historical records. Most significantly, the team discovered a small cave containing what appeared to be relatively recent habitation signs. Inside, they found wall markings similar to those photographed in 1959, though more extensive and complex. Carbon dating of charcoal from a small hearth suggested occupation within the previous decade, the early to mid-1950s. Merrill's official report, submitted to the University of Montana and the Forest Service, provided detailed documentation of these findings while avoiding speculative conclusions. However, his private field notes, now preserved in the university archives, contain more troubling observations. The symbol system shows clear evolution beyond what appears in the historical records. Recursive elements have become more prominent. Spatial relationships between symbols have become more precise. The overall effect when viewing the complete wall is subtly disorienting. Peripheral vision seems to detect movement that disappears when focused upon directly. Several team members have reported unusual dreams since we began documenting the markings. Most disturbing is Merrill's final entry. Dated August 28, 1967, Matthews did not return to camp last night. Search parties found no trace. His field notebook, discovered on his empty sleeping bag, contains increasingly erratic notes from yesterday, culminating in a series of drawings that resemble the cave symbols but appear executed in haste. His final written entry, "I understand now. It's not about communication. It's about perception. We are terminating the expedition immediately." The missing team member, graduate student Paul Matthews, was never found despite an extensive search operation. His disappearance was officially attributed to a hiking accident or animal attack. However, Merrill's private correspondence with Dr. Blackwood, dated September 1967, suggests he believed otherwise. "I fear Matthews has gone the way of Johnson and perhaps others before him." The symbolic system is not merely a record, it's a doorway. Those who begin to comprehend it find themselves drawn through into a mode of perception incompatible with normal human society. I've destroyed my field sketches of the complete wall patterns. I suggest you secure your own materials on this case more carefully. The forests of Montana still harbor many secrets. Development and tourism have transformed much of the landscape, yet vast areas remain relatively untouched. The Cabinet Mountains Wilderness, established in 1964, protects over 94,000 acres of rugged terrain. The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, designated in 1964, encompasses over 1.3 million acres. Within these protected spaces, the deep forests and high mountain valleys, where Johnson once moved, remain largely as they were in his time. Forest Service reports occasionally mention discoveries that might connect to the Johnson case. Unusual arrangements of stones or bones found by backcountry rangers. Trees with unexplained markings observed by fire spotters. Strange sounds reported by wilderness campers. Most are documented and filed without further investigation. Since the Matthews disappearance in 1967, no formal research expedition focused on the Johnson case has been authorized. Yet unofficial interest persists. Hikers occasionally report finding small collections of animal bones arranged in geometric patterns. Hunters describe trees marked with metal objects in remote areas. In 2005, a wilderness photographer claimed to have captured images of cave markings similar to those documented in earlier reports, though he refused to disclose the location and was vague about whether he had sought out the site based on prior knowledge of the case. The photograph, published in a regional nature magazine, shows a stone wall covered with symbols combining spiral elements, radiating lines, and what appear to be stylized animal forms. Analysis by visual anthropologists suggested similarities to both Johnson's journal symbols and certain Native American petroglyphs, though with distinctive elements not present in either tradition. Most notable was the assessment of a neurological researcher who examined the image. The overall composition displays properties similar to those used in optical illusions designed to create depth perception distortions. Extended viewing might induce minor perceptual shifts in susceptibility. Individuals. The magazine later reported receiving numerous letters from readers who claimed to have experienced unusual dreams or subtle perceptual changes after studying the photograph. The editor subsequently issued an apology and retracted the image from the magazine's digital archives, citing potential psychological effects not anticipated at publication. In 2012, a doctoral student in environmental psychology at the University of Montana proposed a research project examining perceptual adaptation in extreme wilderness isolation, with specific reference to historical cases, including that of Abraham Johnson. The proposal was rejected by the university's ethics committee, which cited concerns about psychological risks to researchers and noted the Matthews disappearance as a cautionary precedent. The student subsequently transferred to another institution. The case of Silent Johnson exists at the intersection of documented history and frontier legend. The verifiable facts, his Harvard education, his journey west, the abandoned cabin, the disappearances, the bone arrangements provide the framework for a narrative of psychological transformation under extreme conditions. Yet the gaps in the record leave room for multiple interpretations. Was Johnson simply a man broken by isolation, constructing elaborate fantasies to fill the void left by human absence? Was he a predator who used the wilderness as cover for darker impulses? Or was he, as some more esoteric interpretations suggest, someone who genuinely discovered or created an alternative system of understanding? A human who learned to interpret the world through non-human patterns. Perhaps most disturbing is the suggestion that Johnson's transformation was not unique, that others, from his expedition companion Crawford to the missing travelers, from Marshall Owens to the researchers who studied the case decades later, might have undergone similar perceptual shifts after exposure to the symbolic system he developed. This implies something beyond individual psychology, something potentially transmissible through the symbols themselves. Dr. Merrill, in his final published paper on the case in 1976, proposed what he called environmental recontextualization as a framework for understanding Johnson's transformation. Human consciousness evolved in constant dialogue with natural environments. Our perceptual systems, cognitive frameworks, and even language structures bear the imprint of this evolutionary history. What Johnson may have experienced, and what those who followed his trail may have glimpsed, is not an alien mode of consciousness, but rather an older one, a way of perceiving and engaging with the world that predates our current linguistic and conceptual frameworks. The symbolic system he developed may represent an attempt to bridge these modes of perception, to translate between human language and something more ancient. Merrill's perspective offers a way of understanding the Johnson case that avoids both supernatural explanations and reductive psychological diagnoses. It suggests that Johnson, through his naturalist training, wilderness immersion, and deliberate experimentation with alternative forms of notation, may have accessed cognitive modalities that most humans have, forgotten or never developed, ways of perceiving and engaging with the environment that operate according to different organizational principles than conventional human thought. This interpretation aligns with certain indigenous perspectives. When Michael Finch interviewed Salish elders about The Man Who Speaks to Bones in 1968, one elder told him, "The old people said this man had not gone crazy. They said he had remembered what humans once knew before they had words. He was dangerous not because he wished harm, but because humans are not meant to go backward. Once you learn to speak with the human tongue, you should not try to speak with the older tongue again. It confuses the spirit. The forests of Montana still stand. The wind still moves through the pines with sounds that might be speech, if only we knew how to listen. And somewhere in those vast spaces, the story of Abraham Silent Johnson continues to echo, a warning or an invitation, depending on who might be listening. As Dr. Eleanor Blackwood observed in her final interview, we think of the frontier as something we conquered, but perhaps in some cases it conquered us instead. Johnson didn't just go native, as the old phrase has it. He went beyond native. He went somewhere we don't have words for. And perhaps that's why he stopped using words at all. Today, the forests where Abraham Silent Johnson once moved stand protected as part of national forests and wilderness areas. Visitors seek recreation and natural beauty in landscapes that once harbored a darker mystery. The cabin site has never been conclusively identified. The bone amphitheater remains unfound. The trail marked with metal objects has long since disappeared beneath decades of fallen pine needles and new growth. Yet something of the story persists, carried in academic papers, archive documents, and local legends. Perhaps its endurance speaks to a fundamental human fear, not of the wilderness itself, but of what the wilderness might awaken in us. The case of Silent Johnson suggests that civilization may be more fragile than we care to admit, that a Harvard education and all the structures of human society might dissolve under the right conditions, leaving something older and stranger in their place. In the end, we are left with Johnson's final written words, "They will not find me." Was this a statement of triumph or despair, a threat or a lament? The ambiguity seems fitting for a man who abandoned human language altogether, who chose silence over speech, who may have discovered, or believed he discovered, another way of being in the world. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Johnson case is not what it tells us about one man's transformation in the wilderness of 1860s Montana, but what it suggests about the nature of human consciousness itself. We tend to think of our perceptual and cognitive systems as fixed and universal, the inevitable way that humans process and organize experience. Johnson's case raises the unsettling possibility that these systems are instead contingent and malleable, shaped by cultural context and environmental interaction. What we call reality might be just one possible interpretation among many. As you walk through the forests of western Montana, along trails that wind through ancient pines and across mountain meadows, consider this: the features you notice, the patterns you perceive, the meanings you construct, all are filtered through perceptual frameworks you inherited. What might you see if those frameworks were different? What might you hear in the wind through the trees if you listened with other ears? What alternative order might emerge from the seeming chaos of wilderness if you perceived it through another system entirely? Perhaps it is better not to ask these questions too deeply. Perhaps some boundaries exist for good reason. The story of Silent Johnson, whatever its ultimate truth, serves as both warning and reminder. The wilderness is not empty space waiting for human interpretation. It has its own logic, its own patterns, its own forms of order that long predate human language and understanding. Those who immerse themselves too completely in this older reality may find their way back to human society, increasingly difficult to navigate. In November 1969, a hunter named Gerald Morris became separated from his party during a snowstorm in the Cabinet Mountains. Morris spent 3 days alone before finding his way back to a Forest Service road. During his debriefing with rangers, Morris mentioned finding shelter in a small cave where he observed strange markings on the walls. When asked to elaborate, he became visibly uncomfortable and changed the subject. The incident report notes that Morris appeared unusually withdrawn following his rescue and that he resigned from his job as a high school science teacher shortly thereafter. County records indicate he purchased a remote property near the Montana-Idaho border, where he lived with minimal contact with neighbors until his death in 1998. Morris's isolated cabin was examined following his death. Forest Service personnel conducting the inspection reported finding numerous journals filled with unidentifiable symbols and walls covered with elaborate diagrams combining animal tracks, astronomical notations, and abstract patterns. Most disturbing was the discovery of a hidden room accessible only through a concealed entrance, containing what the report described as a complex arrangement of animal bones, stones, and metal objects, suspended from the ceiling in a mobile-like configuration. The property was subsequently purchased by the Forest Service, and the cabin demolished as a potential attractive nuisance. The journals and other materials were supposedly transferred to university archives, though no record of their arrival exists. The story of Gerald Morris represents a coda to the Johnson case. Another educated man who entered the wilderness and encountered something that fundamentally altered his relationship with human society. Like the graduate student Matthews, like Dr. Stern, like Marshall Owens before them, Morris appears to have been drawn into the alternative perceptual framework that Johnson first documented in his journals and bone arrangements. The pattern suggests something beyond coincidence or individual psychological vulnerability. It points toward what Dr. Merrill called environmental recontextualization, a fundamental shift in how consciousness organizes sensory input, triggered by specific environmental conditions and potentially facilitated by exposure to certain symbolic systems. If this interpretation is correct, the wilderness itself becomes not merely the setting for these transformations, but an active participant in them. In the end, we are left with Johnson's final written words, "They will not find me." Perhaps the true meaning of this statement lies not in physical concealment, but in perceptual divergence. Perhaps Johnson meant that those who continued to perceive and think according to conventional human frameworks would no longer be able to recognize or understand him, not because he had vanished, but because he had become something operating according to different principles entirely. The forests remain. The symbols endure, carved into cave walls and tree trunks, arranged in bones and stones across remote valleys. The story continues to echo through academic papers and local legends. And somewhere in the vast wilderness areas of western Montana, the trail that Elias Woodbury discovered behind Johnson's cabin in 1865 may still exist, not as a physical path visible to ordinary perception, but as a route into another way of seeing, another way of being, another way of understanding the relationship between consciousness and environment. For those who walk the forests today, this possibility remains both warning and temptation. The wilderness still has the power to transform those who immerse themselves in it completely. The choice that Silent Johnson made to abandon human language and society in favor of a different system of order remains available to those willing to follow his trail to its conclusion. Whether that choice represents transcendence or tragedy depends entirely on one's perspective. As Dr. Blackwood wrote in her final notes on the case, the boundary between human and non-human is not as fixed as we pretend. Johnson crossed that boundary deliberately, systematically, irreversibly. Others have followed, drawn by the symbols he left behind. The forest continues to speak. Some continue to listen, and occasionally someone answers. The sun sets over the Montana wilderness. Shadows lengthen among the pines. In the distance, a sound carries on the wind, not quite animal, not quite human. The forest waits, patient and ancient, speaking in a language older than words to those who have learned how to listen.